Hi everyone, Chris here with some thoughts on the Patricia Hill Collins piece on mammies, matriarchs, and other controlling images. This is probably the hardest reading where we're going to have this semester, so hang in there and really work through it. It's a pretty good piece and a little bit more of just some harder stuff that you'll read in sociology. So for you non-soc majors, it might be a challenge. For the few soc majors and other folks, it probably will be a little more familiar. It won't be quite so strange, but it's important. I think it's a good piece, and working through it, we'll get to flesh out some of the ideas that Scott's talking about. All right, so let's see. Two things. One you see in this piece is the things that Scott mentions, but I don't think really develops that much, is the intersectionality of oppression and various forms of discrimination. And all that intersectionality means is that there's an intersection. It's where two or more things meet, right? So that in the particular case of black women, which this article's about, what you have is, in addition to racial discrimination, you also have other elements of discrimination. In sociology, you have the big three going on, right? The big three in sociology being race, class, and gender. Those are sort of the big social gaps in the areas of discrimination and disconnect that sociology tends to focus on, though there are others, social gaps and social discriminations, right? So that for black women, Hill keeps on talking about how the discrimination or oppression of class, race, and gender overlap and mutually enforce each other. And what that means is that, say, for black women, they are experience a racial hierarchy in which, in the society at large, blacks are near the bottom of the racial hierarchy in the United States. It also means that their experience and they receive discrimination. Also, as women, they receive discrimination in a gender hierarchy or ranking within the United States. And then finally, often, though not always, they're also at the bottom of a class hierarchy as well, due to historic discrimination and systems of oppression and sort of just how things have worked out historically, that for many black women, they've also been in the lower working class or poor class folks. So that's another form of social life in which they receive discrimination as well. So that these things sort of overlap, mutually reinforce, and ultimately disempower black women. All right, so this article, of course, is a bit about stereotypes and sort of ideologies of control. And stereotypes, images, is something that needs to be thought about for various ways of controlling people, right? So, for example, for women, and to some degree nowadays men, in the area of gender, women, you could look at it in terms of pictures of women's bodies in the media and in various forms of media and advertising and stuff, are often quite unrealistic in terms of body types, body expectations, beauty expectations. And from a critical standpoint, you could say, wow, these images are used to control women to a certain degree. Not always successfully, and certainly not all women feel that much pressure. But if you go around and ask, I wouldn't be surprised if people do feel a little bit of pressure, sort of worrying about their weight or worrying about their appearance and stuff, right? So that this is an example, not a race-based one, but an example of how images do control people and sort of can ultimately disempower them, right? So, for example, in the gender issue, like if a woman's constantly worrying about how she looks, she may not have enough time in the day or mental space or whatever to really sort of fully encounter sort of maybe any problem she's having at work or something like that. I mean, that's a little bit of a simplification, but you get the point that those images can be used by folks to disempower people. Now, let's talk about some of the specifics in the Collins piece. First of all, mammies. To some degree, it may be worth doing a quick Google search just to get a mammy image. But in general, a mammy was sort of a leftover image of both, well, of the time of slavery and afterwards, when black women often were working as domestic workers in white households, and to a certain degree they were thought of as sort of as taking on white values and being very supportive, nurturing, especially young children and babies, white folks, and especially white men, right? So that mammies were sort of a simplification and an image that very much was an image of the good black woman in particular, right? And I think that Collins does a good job of describing that. The problem is, of course, is that this controlled black women, in that they sort of had to be in a role where they were non-threatening to whites, where they weren't, necessarily concerned about their own needs in life or their own family members' needs in life, but they're actually much more concerned about the needs and nurturing of white folks, right? So this is the image. Now, along comes another image that she juxtaposes to the mammies, is that of the matriarch. And the matriarch, of course, means like the rule of the woman and the woman's rule. And that's a much later image that she talks about in the mid-60s that kind of came out of a famous report that she cites there in the condition of the black family. And that was very critical of the strong role within black families that women had to take on. But because of various problems going on within society or whatever, that sometimes was seen as critical for them being too strong. That because of problems within the African American community, complicated histories on all those, the matriarchs tended to be blamed for a lot of those problems. In those cases, they were often seen as, black women were often portrayed rather as too aggressive and not enough in tune with the white values, where the mammies were very much, in tune with white values, whatever precisely those are or whatever, that they sort of were not as matriarchs, okay? In the 80s, another image that really came to me, in 70s and 80s, I guess, really, was that of the welfare queen, right? So that someone who is overly dependent on public services for her family's well-being, whereas the matriarch was aggressive. The welfare queen, or welfare mom, was not aggressive enough with respect to sort of her own independence and everything, and that she became sort of a leech on the system, and was seen as a problem. Now, the second to last image she brings up is that of the black ladies, right? So that those are actually the black women who sort of reached the middle class, had some professional aspirations that they've met, but that nevertheless seen as threatening to whites because of things like affirmative action. So that those people, the black ladies, are seen as a threat because they will take your job because of affirmative action. All right. And so that all of these things, how do they control? Well, first of all, they control by oversimplifying sort of real complex people who have, challenges in life like everyone else, and sort of need to be true to identity and their history in ways without being sort of simplified and having expectations and held up against them. And all of these positions, all these images rather, do have two basic functions. One is they sort of blind us to the workings of the overall system, right? So that if the system is putting in multiple forms of discrimination against black women, these images put the blame squarely on the black women as the cause of the problem, right? With the exception of the mammies. So if people don't want to be a mammy, then they can be a matriarch, where they're seen as too aggressive and out of line with the values necessary to succeed in white-dominated society. Or they're the welfare queens, and that they're leeching off the system. Or black ladies, okay, they have some form of success, but really, ultimately, they're job stealers. What they're sort of setting the black women up with unrealistic expectations, and saying, if you don't have success, it's really your own fault, right? So that we do that. and you're blinding us to the working of the system. And that's the second thing, so that instead of looking at the system and seeing how it might work and sort people out in unfair ways, it ultimately just keeps on putting us, comparing real women to these particularly simplified images. It keeps on, making both those women feel pressure to conform to those images, as well as other folks looking at them and saying, why don't you conform to these images? And it helps make them responsible rather than the system. And ultimately, as Hill talks about at the beginning of the article, it helps make them other. It makes them different than us in some way. Because we, of course, sort of understand ourselves and people like ourselves as complex beings who are struggling with different obligations and different stresses. But these images all sort of simplify and don't let us see them as real, fully developed human beings. And that is an integral, important part of sort of any ideological system, in terms of not letting us see sort of the challenges and successes of people as they are, but rather simplifying them and making us not get the bigger picture and the human complexity.